Over the course of 2 weeks in the spring of 2020, a series of brutal attacks in Northern California left 3 people dead and 1 injured. The police quickly identified their killer, a tree trimmer who'd worked on the property of 2 of his victims, and tracked him down to a remote part of Butte County. Police showed up to arrest him while he was in the process of attacking his 5th victim, just in time to save the man's life. Let's get into it. Hi folks, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Delaney and I'm a true crime writer and a big time murder nerd. On this channel, I cover some of the more recent and lesser known criminals, the B list of serial killers, so to speak. And I've been known to cuss a time or two. So if you're into that sort of thing, go ahead and subscribe. If not, that's cool. You do you. So for today's video, we're going back to the spring of 2020 when a series of extremely brutal attacks were taking place in rural Northern California. It might seem strange that such a big crime story wasn't really picked up by the news outside of that area, but then there was probably some other really big story that might have been sucking up all the oxygen. Anyway, early on the morning of May 23rd, 2020, the Tehama County Sheriff's Department was called to the home of Lorene and Homer Sievers in Los Molinos. There, they found the door had been broken in, and Lorene, who was 88, dead. Her throat had been slashed, although the autopsy report would later find her cause of death was from a single stab wound to her chest. Her husband, Homer, who was 91, had escaped the attack and run to his nephew's house next door to call 911. He had also been stabbed and his throat slashed. He had to be airlifted to the closest hospital where they were thankfully able to save his life. And although the door to the Sievers' home had been broken into, there was no evidence of a robbery or any other kind of crime. The only other thing that was out of the ordinary for the couple was that just a few days earlier, they had had a landscaping crew out to their property to do some tree trimming. Skip ahead about a week later to the city of Oroville, which is about 40 miles north of Sacramento. It's in Butte County, which borders Tehama County. On the evening of June 4th, the Oroville police were called to the home of 82-year-old Sandra George. There, they found her dead from stab wounds to her throat. Like at the Sievers scene, there was no evidence of robbery or any other crime. And like the Sievers, George had had a landscaping crew at her home that same day to do some tree trimming work. Only 2 days later, the Oroville Fire Department was called out to a vehicle fire near Pine and Robinson Streets. They quickly determined that the fire had been started with an accelerant, so an arson investigation was opened. Investigators learned that the car was registered to 57-year-old Vicki Klein, who wasn't in the car or anywhere else. Family members said they had last seen Klein earlier that day. She had been downtown with a friend, a 37-year-old tree trimmer named Ryan Blinston. Now, Blinston had a record, but nothing violent. He'd stolen a car when he was 22 and led police on a high-speed chase before surrendering. Later, he committed 3 burglaries where he stole guns and another car. So investigators got a warrant and searched Blinston's car, where they found blood. The DNA was a match for Klein's. So with that blood evidence, as well as eyewitnesses, placing him as the last person seen with Klein, the Oroville PD was able to charge him with arson and issue a warrant for his arrest. Since Klein was missing, he was listed as a person of interest in her disappearance as well. As they looked closer into Blinston, they discovered that he had worked for the landscaping company that the Sievers and George had hired in the days before their attacks. The company confirmed that Blinston had worked at both properties. Police then tracked down where he was now staying with a 50-year-old man named Robert Smith, who lived in his RV in an extremely remote area near Brush Creek. So remote there was no cell phone service, which is kind of important. Because of his history of fleeing law enforcement and their suspicions about his potential for violence, The Butte County Sheriff's Office decided to use a SWAT team and approach in the early morning hours of June 14th. After they'd gotten about a quarter mile into the property, they heard the sounds of someone yelling for help and banging noises, which got louder as they got closer to the man's RV. When they got to the RV, the deputies, who were using night vision goggles, were able to see Blinston standing in the dark holding a hatchet. Blinston apparently didn't see them and was walking back towards the RV. Once they got close enough, the deputies turned on their flashlights and identified themselves and ordered Blinston to surrender. Blinston immediately fled into the woods, still carrying the hatchet. Some of the deputies ran after him and some went into the RV. The deputies who chased Blinston found him hiding in some brush, still holding the hatchet. According to their report, they told him multiple times to drop the hatchet, but he refused, so they tased him and pepper sprayed him. And while I'm normally against using this kind of overwhelming force against a suspect, in this case, I think it was pretty well justified. So after a short struggle, Blinston was taken into custody. He was medically cleared and booked into the Butte County Jail on the warrant for arson. Anyway, back to the deputies who went into the RV. Inside, they found Smith bleeding heavily from multiple stab wounds, including a 6-inch gash to his neck. They did their best to try and treat his injuries, but because they were so serious, they knew he needed to get to a hospital ASAP. But because the property was so remote and there was no cell phone service, they knew it would take too long for an ambulance to get there. So they transported him in a sheriff's office vehicle to where a life flight helicopter was waiting to fly him to a local hospital. He had emergency surgery and thankfully survived the attack. So that was pretty crazy in a good way. But you've got to hear the rest of the story. Smith told investigators that Blinston was a friend of a relative and a few days ago had asked him if he could camp on his property. He'd agreed, and the two had been getting along fine. He said, "We drank beer, smoked, and shot the breeze." That evening, Blinston had asked if he could sleep with him inside the RV since he was afraid of getting attacked by a bear. So Smith agreed. He said he'd woken up to Blinston attacking him with a knife. He'd slashed his neck and stabbed him in the arm. Despite being seriously wounded, Smith was able to fight Blinston off and push him out of the RV and lock the door. But Blinston went to his campsite and got his hatchet, which he was using to try and literally hack his way back into the RV. Even though he was bleeding heavily from his wounds, Smith used an axe handle to fight Blinston off just long enough until the SWAT team arrived. This guy is a fucking badass. Anyway, for the attack on Smith, Blinston was charged with attempted murder. And because of his probable connection to the Seavers and George murders, they were able to get a warrant for his phone data. Sure enough, Blinston's phone placed him at the homes of the Seavers and George when they were murdered. In fact, he had returned to the Seavers' home after he had worked on the landscaping crew, like he had been casing the joint. Then, on June 21st, Klein's body was found in the Feather River by an angler. She had cuts to her throat just like Blinston's other victims. In all, Blinston was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder for Lorraine Seavers, Sandra George, and Vicki Klein, 2 counts of attempted murder for the attacks on Homer Seavers and Robert Smith, arson, and resisting arrest. His charges were also enhanced because he had used a deadly weapon, attacked an elderly victim, and committed multiple killings. He pled not guilty. His trial started on May 2nd, 2022, and on August 4th, he was found guilty on all charges. He was given 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. I'm not really sure what else to say about this guy. It's really weird that he had no history of violence, and then one day in his late 30s, he suddenly snaps and does this. And I don't think it was the case that he'd killed before and just gotten away with it. This guy does not seem smart enough to pull that kind of thing off. I mean, he was caught in less than a month. So what are your thoughts about this case? Let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, give it a like. And if you want more terrible stories like this, be sure and subscribe. You can also support me on Patreon. The link is in the description. Till next time, Darklings.